Just because ambiences sit in the background doesn't mean they have to be boring. We've got stingers, we've got transitions, we've even got day and night cycles. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to build them all. So if you're new to the channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button along with the notification bell so you don't miss out on any future content. And if you'd like to be a part of the Sound Effects Guy Discord server, you'll find a link in the description below. So with that being said, let's get started. So let's start with stingers. And to showcase this, I've got this forest level set up, and in front of me, I've got two box triggers. Now this is modular. You can set this up however you want, but just for the sake of showcasing, I've just got simple box triggers in front of me. So what's going to happen is when we hit play, you can hear that we have a general forest ambience. And so then let's say your player comes along an area that has a bunch of birds. And now you can hear that that bird layer kind of fades into that ambience. And as they're moving around their level, maybe they come across a place where there's a lot of insects. And so now you can hear that insect layer added to that ambience. We still have the base ambience playing, and you can set these up however you want. I have them set up as additional layers. You can have them as one-offs. Say maybe at a certain area in your level, you want the player to hear maybe a dog barking or something off in the distance. You can set that up in the same way. So what we're going to do is I'm going to show you how I set up the meta sound first, and then the level blueprint, and we'll go from there. So inside our meta sound, I have three wave players. This first wave player is for our base ambience. That's what's playing the forest day bass loop. And then I have two triggers here to trigger our birds and our insects. Now, what's driving this whole thing is actually this trigger route and this interpolate 2. When we start the level, we have our on play. It plays our bass forest sound. I have it set to loop, and that just plays. Now, as we enter this bird trigger, not only is it going to start this bird loop, but what it's also going to do is on this trigger route, it is going to set this gain value from 0 to 5. And these are ambiguous numbers. You can set them up however you want. These values are going to be the amplitude of that layer. So you're essentially mixing your layers together right here. And as it sets it to 5, in our interpolate 2, our interp time, I have it set to 3. So it's over the course of 3 seconds. It's going to take it from whatever value it is currently, and it's going to move it to an amplitude of 5 over 3 seconds. And what it's also going to do is it's going to set this one to 0 over the course of 3 seconds. And the reason that I have it set up this way is, say the player encounters the bugs first. So because I have the bugs set to set our amplitude or our gain to 2, then that's what it's going to be when we get to the birds. So then it's also going to take, when we reach the birds, it's going to take that from 2 back down to 0. And so I'm going to go ahead and zoom out on this just so you can see the whole thing. You know, if you need to pause the video, if you're looking to set it up exactly like this, or take a screenshot. So this is how the meta sound is set up. But obviously we need to jump into our level blueprint because we need to access those box triggers. And this part's really fairly simple. So we have our event begin play, which adds our audio component. That's what starts the base ambience. And from there, our audio component, just like every other meta sound video that we've done, we're getting our parameter interface. This is what allows us to tap into the other triggers or functions or just any type of variable asset within our meta sound. And now we can have our bird trigger that, because it's looking at our parameter interface, and we have this named birds, which is the exact same input name that we have here, it's going to set off this trigger. And the same with our other box trigger. And so that is why when we're in our level, when we hit these box triggers, you hear the birds fade in again over 3 seconds. And then our bugs fade in over 3 seconds and our birds fade out. So next we're going to take a look at transitioning full ambiences. So this scene that I have set up here, I've got 3 different areas. I've got this forest area. I've got this city or, exterior shot. And then the player does have access to inside the bank. So I've got this set up in a way so that the player starts in the wooded area. They move into the city. They can come into the bank. And as they exit the bank, we move back into that city ambience. Now, there is something important to note. First of all, I know this is a very harsh cutoff. Typically, if you had a scene set up that looked like this, you would have some bleed over. Again, just to showcase the setup. So we've got our box trigger for our wooded area. We've got our box trigger for our city. And then for our bank, one of the things that's important to note is this bank trigger box is actually technically housed within the city trigger. And we'll get to how I set that up here in just a second. So let's take a look at our meta sound real quick. So again, because I have 3 different areas, I have 3 different wave players, you would set this up based on however many different ambiences you have. This first one is for our forest. The second one is our city, and the last one is our bank. Now on this forest wave player, I've got this trigger any. So I have a specific trigger to start the forest. And this comes into play when the player moves from the city into the forest. But because the player starts in the forest, we need to also trigger that sound from begin play because they're already inside that trigger box. So they're not going to trigger it until they leave the area and come back. So this trigger any allows me to input multiple triggers to trigger this one event. And the on play allows me to start that from the beginning of play. That's all that's set up to do. But if we zoom down here, you're going to notice some similarities between this setup and our stingers. So again, we have the trigger route into the interpolate 2, and that's what's controlling our gain for our output. Now, because I have 3 different triggers that are sending and different volumes, I use the trigger float 3 instead of the 2 like we did on the stinger, but the setup is essentially the same. So we've got our forest start, which is setting this first value, which is the forest, to 1, and it's setting everything else to 0. We've got our city, which very similarly is setting the city to 1 and everything else to 0. And then finally we have our bank, which, as I'm sure you could guess, is then doing the exact same thing with the bank ambience. Now, let's say, you know, in a real world situation, if you were entering the bank and there was a lot of traffic outside, you may still hear some of the city ambience. So because the bank is this third value and our city is the second value, we don't have to set this to 0. We can set it to maybe 0.5 or 0.25 or, you know, wherever it fits in your mix. We can also add things like a low pass filter so that you might hear the low end bustle of the city outside, but you won't hear any of the high end frequencies that would get reflected by the bank walls. So I will go ahead, just like I did before, I will zoom out on this so that you can see the whole thing. And now we'll move on to the blueprint. And again, blueprint setup, very similar to our stingers, very simple. We have our event begin play, which adds our meta sound component. And again, because we're allowing this on play trigger, that's what allows our forest ambience to start right at the beginning of that level. We're getting our parameter interface as usual, and then we move into those trigger boxes. So the forest trigger triggers the forest sound, the city trigger triggers the city sound. And now, because our interior of our bank is housed within the city exterior, the player technically never leaves the city box when they're inside the bank. So what I've done is when the player enters this trigger box for the bank, you know, it fires off our meta sound for this bank, which takes all the volumes down to 0 for everything else. But then I've also got an on-actor end overlap for the bank, which actually re-triggers the city because that's where they're going to. They're moving from the inside of the bank back out into that city. So now that we've seen that setup, I'll play it again. So we're in our forest. We move into our city. We move into our bank, which again is still technically within the city trigger box. But because I have that end overlap trigger set up, we exit the bank. We're now back into the city. For this last segment, it's honestly probably going to be our shortest segment because most of the stuff in this particular setup we've already covered. So I've got this park set up and I have a sequence player that over the course of 5 seconds, what it's going to do is this first one is going to change our directional light from a daytime position to a nighttime position. These 4 event tracks here, I have 4 lampposts set up with light bulbs, and these light bulbs will go from a 0 intensity at the start of this play, and then once it hits this point, it's going to ramp up to a 8 on the intensity. So what that looks like, if I go ahead and play this sequence for you. As the sequence plays, the sun goes down and our lights come on. And I've got this set up on my T key. This is totally modular. You can set this up however you want. I'm not going to go into too much with day-night stuff. But if you want to use real time or in-game time or whatever time that you've set up or however you want to trigger this, this is totally up to you. Again, I just have it set to the T key over 5 seconds for the sake of showcasing. So in terms of our meta sound, there's nothing in here that we haven't already talked about before. So we've got 2 wave players, one for daytime, one for nighttime. I have a trigger any, which has my on play and I do have a daytime trigger set up. Again, that's because the game starts in daytime, so we want that daytime ambience to play from the beginning. We have a daytime input trigger. That way, when we're transitioning from night into day, that triggers. Then vice versa, we have a nighttime trigger that transitions from daytime into nighttime. And how we're controlling this, again, is nothing that you haven't seen already in this video. We have a trigger route and our interpolate. Again, you can set the interpolate time to change based on your daytime, nighttime, how fast or how slow that happens. You can adjust that accordingly, as well as your gain. So in terms of the level blueprint, I've got our event begin play, adds our audio component, we're getting the interface, and we have triggers. Again, nothing that you haven't seen before. The way that I have the triggering set up, however, like I mentioned, I have my T key set up to flip-flop. When I press it, it plays that sequence forwards, and then when I press it again, it will change and play that sequence in reverse. Now, how I personally have these triggers being called is I'm looking at that light intensity. So basically, I'm looking at the light and I'm pulling off just the intensity value, and I'm running this into a true-false branch. So if this intensity is anything less than 8, which is what I have it set to go to in that level sequence, then it will start triggering that daytime ambience, because if the light is less than 8, that means the sun is coming up and that light is being shut off. Vice versa, if it's greater than 0, that means the light has come on, which means it's nighttime. And so we are triggering our nighttime ambience. I have these set up to reset because I do have a do once. Because I'm using the event tick, if we just ran this branch to the audio component, it would sound very glitchy. You would just hear the first part of that audio file just getting repeated, and it sounds terrible. So we only want it to play this once, but we need something to reset it. So if it's going to nighttime, then we want to go ahead and reset this so that our nighttime can be played, and vice versa. Again, I know that this is kind of redundant at this point, but you can set this up however you want. If you want to look at the directional light rotation, and when it gets past a certain point, it triggers and on its way back. This, for the sake of showcase, is just how I have this set up. All right, so I'll go ahead and play this for you now. And so we're in our park. It's daytime. We can hear the daytime ambience because we hear the birds. And then if I hit the T key, see our sun go down. Because that light intensity went above 0, that triggered our nighttime ambience. And then going back the other way. Again, this setup is very similar to the ambient transitions that we did with the forest and the city and the bank. We're just using a different value to trigger those sounds. All right, so that's going to wrap things up with dynamic ambience. Hopefully this was something that you found informative. If there's anything that you'd like to see me cover on the channel, let me know in the comments below, or you can get a hold of me on the Sound Effects Guy Discord server. Until next time.